Just past 12, so I can't say good morning, so I'll say greetings. To begin with, I must thank the IDSA and the conference organizers for inviting me and sharing my thoughts. I'm going to give a technology perspective. We have been listening to the kind of problems that one is facing because of the gap between supply and demand of energy resources. So, do we have an answer in the technology? I might sound a note of caution that my presentation might come across as a bit too simplistic, and indeed it could be. At the same time, it is an indication that there is much to be done in terms of what we can do to resolve the dilemma of how to meet the energy demand and yet not endanger the environment. Since morning we have been listening how the oil dependence is very high and how to manage that, how to manage the domestic demand and how to manage the international equations, so on and so forth. But what's happening is the high dependence is causing a greenhouse gas emission which is order of magnitude higher than natural. And by some estimates, our planet is already 1.6 degrees centigrade or 2 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than it has been in the pre-industrial thousands of years. And signs of climate change are already there. The consequence of this increased emission is that these effects are cumulative, and therefore there will be a point in time where the carbon concentration will be so high that it will be a tipping point kind of a situation beyond which one cannot prevent irreversible climate changes. World population crossed 7 billion last year, and of course the total energy consumption was colossal, whether you look at it in terawatts or million tons of oil equivalent. The interesting aspect of it is that almost 78% of that was consumed by the industrially advanced nations, which supported a population of only 20%, whereas the remaining 80% in the other parts of the world used only about 22% of the energy. That picture is changing, and we have been hearing about it. Rapid industrialization in the fast developing countries will witness a rise in per capita consumption by a much larger population. Effectively, we are talking about the human entity as a consumer. And if that happens, and it's bound to happen, the demand for energy and also consequent increase in the GHG emissions. So by some estimates, world energy consumption will grow by about 45% by the year 2035, and the global CO2 emission will also probably increase by about 42% in the same period, primarily because almost 85% of our energy is coming out of the carbon sources. It's obvious from the discussion we have had in this morning that until this next 20 years, management of the oil-based energy, carbon-based energy is going to be the most important aspect. But if you want to look beyond that, perhaps there are answers. So, from the 85%, if we say that we look at a possible different kind of an energy mix, then maybe there is a scenario that one can hope for. For instance, the 45% increase in consumption by 2035 looks inevitable. However, if world over we were to be able to increase the renewable energy share to 50% from the 15% that is today, we are actually bringing down the emission to around 20%, 21%. Therefore, there is an urgent need for technology innovation and cost-related investments. Even for carbon sequestration, there will be innovation and investments requirement. so that the sequestration can be done at an affordable cost. There is a price to sequestration, and that will weigh as to how much one can do. What's the cost of not achieving this? There will be economically painful cuts in the future energy usage, lifestyle changes, or we are going to face environmental disaster that can threaten human survival. To this audience, I need not talk about Kyoto Protocol, but we all see that the second line, there is no agreement yet on who should do what and by when. And that is what is the crux of the whole thing, that the more we delay to come to terms and agree on our share of responsibility, the more difficult it is going to get. Carbon concentration, by some estimates, is 385 parts per million today. In fact, not today, it was 2010, end of 2010. And the tipping point, by some calculation, could be anywhere above 400 ppm. So we are pretty close. And if we maintain the business as usual, I guess it won't be surprising that we come to that tipping point in next 30 years. Therefore, globally, it is imperative that the GHG emission is contained to what the nature can absorb without getting hot. And here I'm going to look at some predictions by a very nice documentary by the National Geographic. The title of that documentary, many people might have seen, The 6 Degrees Could Change Our World Drastically. It predicts that unless corrective actions are taken, we are looking at 3 degrees centigrade rise by 2050 and 4 degrees centigrade rise by 2080. What does it mean? 3 degrees centigrade rise by that documentary. Arctic ice cap disappear completely. Amazon rainforest will dry up into desert. That's a major biodiversity. Category 6 hurricanes across most tropical coastlines. And at 4 degrees, we are looking at Antarctic ice sheets completely collapsing, flooding the low-level cities. New deserts will spread across southern Europe with death and devastation. So very clearly we are at an age of consequence where economic sacrifices will be necessary for preserving the environment for the future of the mankind. I'll once again try to bring in what we have been discussing today morning. In the short term, we are indeed looking at the management of the resources that are available to us, but in the long term, there is just no alternative to creating alternate resources. And obviously, the alternate resources better be the clean and renewable resources. So we are really looking at a completely new paradigm in the energy market. Sorry. Many of us are familiar with this hot, fat, crowded world of Thomas Friedman. It is indeed getting crowded, hotter than ever before. We are all experiencing it. And what else is happening in the crowded portion of the that book is that there is an increasing middle class aspiration in countries like China and India on a fast track development path. A huge population is growing, moving into the middle class. Energy consumption and the aspirations of the middle class is very high, and if the adequate supplies are not there, we are really looking at an increasing vulnerability. As just discussed, and Chairman mentioned to it, that we are looking at a complete change of focus. Asia in 2000 was responsible for 60,000 of world population and 40,000 of global GDP. In 2020, we may be looking at 50,000 of population and 60,000 of GDP, 60% of GDP. What happens in Asia, therefore, will affect the world very significantly. Therefore, we are very prominent on the radar of the international community. This morning, we heard our national security advisor say that by including all non-traditional threats or challenges into security might defocus our attention on the real security. And that has been the thought process amongst many thinkers, and therefore we are really now looking at how can we look at it differently. And therefore now there is a concept that national security now encompasses everything that can affect national interest, aspirations, potentials included. But then we don't really want to link it as a security. So there is a changing perception that we are now looking at what is called comprehensive national power to protect the national interests and also to influence the global decision-making process. And it is this comprehensive national power that of course will encompass energy security and everything else, but instead of making only the security community looking into it, once you say comprehensive national power, economists, financiers, academics, everybody will look at it slightly differently. That's the hope. Energy security and sustainable development will be very critical to the comprehensive national power for every nation, but it will be more so for India. And I say so because the energy shortages and the climate changes, the consequences of it will affect the high population density areas of the world much more than the other parts. So, if you want to link global warming to national security, once again, a reminder, global warming is cumulative and therefore concerns and dangers will increase exponentially. Impact on economy and lifestyle will create conflicts among societies and nations. It is clear that politics of energy will shape the world power equations in the future. Energy shortages and common dangers of the climate change will compel nations to redefine national priorities. And where we are heading for is the last bullet. I believe nations will have to learn to compete and cooperate at the same time. And if we do not learn to do that, we are looking at a rather disastrous situation. Energy security and climate change I'm trying to link because we had a climate change session yesterday and energy security session today. Inadequate energy, of course, is a serious threat to national security. Oil and coal will peak someday. There are different views. And in terms of how this energy shortages will impact everything else, and again going back to today's reference by National Security Advisor, that the hardcore security issues also must not be lost track of. A very simple comment I might add to that is that a fighting army or an armed forces which doesn't have adequate security is toothless. Therefore, there is a price to pay if you do not have additional security, even for the hard challenges of the security environment. No wonder that the energy security is occupies a very large focus in the security agenda of progressive nations. Answers, of course, are enhancing global energy efficiency and increasing the share of renewable energy. Absolutely imperative, but how much time will it take? And therefore, we are looking at a new paradigm, as I said, where the 3 E's, the energy, environment, and economics, will control the world. Now I shift to Indian scenario. Chairman said that there is no Asian perspective. Asian perspective, of course, will largely consist of China and India because we are the most populous and second and fourth energy consumers and carbon dioxide emitters and so on and so forth. Indian economy on the fast track, we crossed 1 trillion in 2009. I think because of the exchange rate there was some dip and again it should pick up soon. Expected to grow to 2 million by 2016 and 4 trillion by 2025. Obviously, India will by that time will be clearly the third largest economy. Energy needs will grow from 950 to about 950 gigawatts by 2030, which is about 6 times higher than what it was in 2010. So in 20 years, we are looking at a demand increase of 6 times higher. Already the 4th largest emitter, and despite our per capita emission is only about 1/11 of the US. And I have already said that the global warming will affect the more densely populated countries more seriously. Indian perspective, competition of coal, oil, natural gas and uranium included will get hostile as nations jostle to ensure own energy security. Per capita electricity consumption at 2010 we were at 733 kilowatt hour. For comparison, US was 13,919, Europe was 6,000, China 1,750, and the world average 2,596. Just imagine that if India and China were to go anywhere near world average, what kind of catastrophe we are looking at. In terms of carbon footprint, that is million metric ton per year, broad figures, US 20, Canada 18, Russia 20, Russia 12, Germany 9.6, China 5.3, and India 1.4. And therefore one can see that India often gets into this problem of asking for equity in international dialogue. But one must realize in today's world, India will not be allowed to remain energy intensive, nor will it be allowed to demand energy equity endlessly. So in reality, I think one of my co-panelists just said somewhere that we need to look at not energy independence but energy interdependence. Like we are talking about collective security, we'll have to look at energy as a collective problem and collective approach. At the same time, India must focus on energy efficiency to manage demand. And now I'm going to project a few figures, which is a technology perspective. So if you look at the more use of solar and wind and so on and so forth, the share of renewables in India today is only about 9%, of which wind is 6%. In the wind, as most of you know, we are not done badly. Generation capacity was 13 gigawatts in 2010. We were the 5th largest wind energy producer after US, Germany, China and Spain. The expectations are that the wind energy capacity can go to about 22 gigawatt by 2015. Globally, renewable energy should increase to 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. These are the kind of numbers that one likes to aim for to understand how globally the demand for the carbon-based energy can be reduced. For India and world over, of course, we can take a look at nuclear option. But for India in particular, since the energy gap is too large, we have to have the component of nuclear energy also. And what we need to do probably is 10%. Today we are at 3%, must grow to 10% by 2030 and about 20% by 2050. And I'm saying decline thereafter for the simple reason that on the horizon there are possibilities of other alternatives and other sources that might be available. Let's look at the economics of renewable energy. Cost of generation of electricity per megawatt. I'm talking in terms of crores of rupees, which is 10 million rupees. So you can convert. Coal at 4 crores per megawatt, oil at 5 crores, natural gas 3.5 crores, biogas 4 crores, wind at 6 crores, in fact it is dipping below 6 crores, nuclear at about 9 crores. It might go up a little bit because the safety expenses on safety might go up a little bit. Solar is about 10 to 11 crores, and this is a huge reduction from the kind of estimates that were there 2 years ago, where we were talking about 14 crores per megawatt for the solar. In terms of capacity factor, thermal HY 90%, hydro same, nuclear same, biogas same. But when we come to the renewables, wind, solar and solar concentrated power, that is solar heating the solar, heating of oil or water by solar and then converting it that into a turbine, turning the turbine. We are looking at very small capacity factors, about 20%, which means these plants have to work 5 times more in order to be competing in terms of the compatibility for meeting the demand. But another way of looking at it, thermal of course is the cheapest, but it may get expensive with the oil peaking in the next 4 or 5 decades. Thermal also the highest greenhouse gas emitter, and therefore it will have the carbon tax in future. That will be another increase in cost. Hydro is ideal, but it has its own other implications, and therefore it is ideal only for select areas of geography. Nuclear again is very good for large loads, but it has this other factor in terms of safety. I'll speak about it in a minute. If we are looking at wind, totally clean, but it's intermittent, so there is a negative side. And solar is also limited for 4 or 5 hours, depending on where you are on the earth. But the major factor of solar is that the commissioning time for solar is just about a year. For wind, it's just about 2 years. For nuclear, it used to be 7 and 9 years. So in the long term, the high capacity factors and other technologies are useful, but in the short term, to quickly bridge the gap between the demand and supply, there are some possible answers. Promise of solar energy, again, this is something slightly simplistic but not very far from truth. The sun provides 700 watts of power for every square meter of the Earth's surface. Across half the Earth that gets the sunlight at all time, the total is something like 90 petawatts of power. Our entire civilization uses only 1/6,000th of that energy that is available. In 2010, the solar generating capacity worldwide was about 40 gigawatt, which was less than 1%. Up until now, solar energy capture has been expensive and inefficient, and that's the reason. But today we are now already talking about the Moore's law kind of a scenario in the solar. Efficiency of solar cell was 7% in 2000, 15% in 2010, and one can look at about 30% in 2030. Sorry. Price per watt of solar module dropped from $22 per watt in 1980, when it came after the oil shock of the 72. Today we are talking about under $2 per watt, and we may go under $1 per watt in the next couple of years. Globally, renewable energy, mainly solar and wind, should provide 50% of all energy needs by 2030, and this is possible. The International Energy Agency predicts that solar alone can provide 30% of the world energy supply by 2050. Harnessing solar energy, of course, in 3 ways. We have the solar photovoltaic, the solar concentrated power, and of course the solar water heating and so on and so forth. For us, we have a very large insolence, and therefore every 10 square meter of solar panel for 5-6 hours of sunlight can provide something like 1500 kilowatt hour per year. We have a huge opportunity to use the solar energy to meet our energy security. The solar mission, Indian solar mission, has set the target at about 22 gigawatts by 2022 to sync with the 5-year plan periods. But industry leaders believe that the target can be almost double as much under the right conditions. And if you look at the Chinese targets, they are something like 50 gigawatts by 2020. Installed capacity in India for the solar photovoltaic was about 300 megawatt at the end of 2011, plus 1600 megawatt in pipeline, and therefore we are looking at something like more than 3000 megawatt per year from 2016 onwards. Technology advances are going to give us more efficiency and more cost effectiveness. Of course, it will require investments, R&D, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, solar can be the cheapest, unlimited, and affordable supply. Coming to wind, again I said we have done pretty well, and the potential is quite large. We are looking at possibilities of 65,000 megawatt or 65 gigawatt in the near future. Offshore potentials are also very large because we have a very large coastline, and offshore solar energy can be there, wind energy can be there, and cumulative capacity was about 14,890 megawatt, and we were, of course, the 5th largest. In the long run, wind and solar, which are completely clean, and if they can be in a hybrid form, they could be actually the best solution. In addition, you can have that as a distributed generation mode, that is, use the energy where you produce it, and that's the best way of, most efficient way of doing it, because you are reducing the transmission and distribution losses to almost zero. And these are the possibilities. Looking quickly and very briefly at nuclear, today the percentage share of nuclear energy in the world: France 74, Hungary 42, Sweden 38, South Korea 32, Germany for 28, Japan 29, USA 19, UK 16, China 2, and India 3%. Obviously, today India and China, being on a very steep curve of energy demand, have no option but to look at the nuclear option. We have to generate 6 times more electricity by 2030, and there is a strong case for nuclear to go from 3% to 10% by 2020 and 20% by 2030. Indian nuclear power generation is a long history. We have got end-to-end capacity. There is a 3-stage program, and we intend to go towards the closed cycle fast breeder reactors that will ultimately use the thorium reserves of the country. Something more? Yes, there are some things in offing. The International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, 7 nations are cooperating to see whether thermonuclear fusion reactor can be controlled to give controlled energy. Being a laser scientist, I am very optimistic because I can see that things are possible. Technical feasibility has been solved. What remains to be accomplished is the commercial viability. There are numbers, some say by 2020, some say by 2040, whatever it is. But in the long run, I guess it should be there. Transport sector is looking at the hydrogen fuel to replace oil. And in hydrogen fuel, of course, is very good, but how does one produce it if cost effectively? So many of the new nuclear reactors today are configured to generate hydrogen. New possibilities, of course, one thought is that why not deploy solar panels in the outer space? There is a US-India joint group that is looking at it. The solar energy that is available in the outer space is 7 times more than what is available on the Earth. So even if we lose out 50% in the transmitting that energy back to the Earth, even then we are plus. Similarly, there are also efforts to harness the jet stream velocities for wind generation. In summary, I'll say civilization has to stem the increase of the greenhouse gas emissions within the next 5 years, regardless of the energy demands on account of economic progress or increasing population. GHG demand emission must begin to reduce by 2020 and get down to 1990 levels by before 2050, so that we do not go into that 3 degrees increase and the 4 degree increase scenario. It's a unique challenge for the humanity today, where it probably will ask for lifestyle changes to increase the energy efficiency and moving towards sustainable resources, primarily solar, wind, and nuclear. And if we don't do, I think we are on the brink of a disaster. So I'll end here. Being a technologist, I'm only trying to say that technology can both be the problem or the solution. It's up to us what we make of it. Thank you.